The dry wind of Redemption Gulch carried two things in equal measure: dust and disdain. It coated the back of Nita's throat and settled like a shroud on her spirit. She stood before the counter of Croft's Mercantile, the air thick with the scent of cured leather, bulk coffee, and the cloying sweetness of cheap candy in glass jars. Her own scent of wood smoke and the clean, earthy smell of the river clay she worked seemed an intrusion here. In her hands, she held the reason for her visit. It was a water jug, an olya, its surface a warm, terracotta red polish to a soft gleam. Around its belly, a geometric pattern in black and white, a repeating design of storm clouds and lightning, spoke of her people's prayers for rain. It was a good piece. The walls were thin but strong, the shape perfectly balanced. It had taken her 4 days of patient work, from digging the clay at the sacred bend in the river to the final, nerve-wracking firing in her simple pit kiln. Across the counter, Silas Croft picked at a stain on his waistcoat with a grimy fingernail. He was a man whose features seemed to have been eroded by petty cruelties, his eyes small and perpetually assessing value, not worth. He spared the olya glance that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. "What is it you need, girl?" he asked, his voice flat. Nita's gaze did not waver, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She was 3 moons a widow, 7 moons with child, and a fever had been clinging to her for a week, leaving her weak and her head aching. Her husband, Cale, would never have allowed her to suffer this indignity. But Cale's spirit now walked the wind, and she was alone. "Medicine," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The doctor said you have the quinine tonic." Croft grunted. He gestured a thumb toward a shelf behind him, where dusty amber bottles stood in a neat, expensive row. "Cost $2. $2. It might as well have been 2,000. She had nothing. Nothing but her hands, her knowledge, and the earth itself. She gently pushed the olya forward until its base rested on the scarred wooden countertop. "I will trade." For the first time, Croft actually looked at the pot. He picked it up, his thick fingers clumsy against its delicate curves. He turned it over, rapped it with a knuckle. "An Indian pot," he said, the words a dismissal. "What am I to do with this?" "Sell it to some passing fool for a few bits." He let out a short, derisive laugh. "It'll likely break before it leaves the county." "It is strong," Nita said, her pride a hot coal in her chest. "The design is a prayer for water. For life." "I ain't in the business of prayers, girl. I'm in the business of coin." He set the pot down with a dismissive thud that made her flinch. Still, he saw her desperation. He saw the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, the way she held one hand protectively over her swollen belly. An ugly, predatory gleam entered his eyes. "Tell you what," he said, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous condescension. "You look poorly. I'll give you a bottle of Wright's Blood Purifier. Less potent than the quinine, but it's something." He gestured to a different shelf, where cheaper, more colorful bottles promised miracle cures for a quarter. One pot, a vessel of her culture, her skill, her prayers for a bottle of snake oil. The injustice of it was a physical blow. Humiliation washed over her, hot and bitter. She could feel the eyes of the 2 other customers in the store, a pair of grizzled prospectors, boring into her back. She was a spectacle, the pregnant Apache widow begging for scraps. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pot. She would go. She would return to her wickiup, drink willow bark tea, and pray to the spirits for strength. She would not accept this insult. Her child would be born to a mother with dignity, even if they had nothing else. "That seems like a rather poor business decision, Mr. Croft." The voice was unexpected. It was calm, cultured, and carried an accent that was utterly foreign to Redemption Gulch. It came from a man standing near the doorway, half hidden in the afternoon shadows. As he stepped forward, the light caught the fine wool of a dark, perfectly tailored suit, a stark contrast to the denim and canvas of the other men. He was tall and slender, with a face that seemed too pale and thoughtful for this harsh country. His eyes, a clear, intelligent gray, were fixed on Silas Croft. The store owner straightened up, his expression shifting from predatory to resentful. "This ain't your affair, mister." The stranger ignored him. He walked to the counter, his polished leather shoes making almost no sound on the dusty floorboards. He looked not at Nita, but at the Alya. He reached out a long-fingered hand and traced the lightning pattern, his touch surprisingly gentle, reverent. "May I?" he asked, his gaze finally lifting to meet Nita's. She was so taken aback, she could only nod. He picked up the pot, holding it correctly, his hands cupping its weight as if he understood its balance. "The symmetry is remarkable," he murmured, almost to himself. "The walls are incredibly thin. This isn't utilitarian wear. This is art." He looked back at Croft, his gray eyes turning cold. "You offered her a bottle of sugar water for this?" "Sir, in my city, a piece of this quality would fetch $50. Perhaps more." A stunned silence fell over the store. $50. The prospectors stared, their mouths slightly agape. Croft's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The stranger set the Alya back down carefully. He turned his full attention to Nita. The coldness in his eyes was replaced by a look of weary compassion. "Ma'am, my name is Arthur Pembroke. Forgive my intrusion, but I will give you $10 for this piece." In gold. From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a gleaming $10 eagle and placed it on the counter. It shone against the dark wood like a tiny sun. $10. It was more money than she had seen in a year. It was medicine and food and blankets for the coming winter. It was survival. Croft stared at the coin as if it were a coiled snake. His greed warred with his wounded pride. Nita looked from the coin to the stranger's face. He was a white man, a man from the city, a banker by the look of his clothes. Her people's history was a long, bitter lesson in a white man's promises. Yet, she saw no deceit in his eyes. She saw respect. He had seen the value in her work when others saw only a clay pot. He had defended its worth. He had defended her. Her throat was tight. She gave a single, sharp nod. Arthur Pembroke pushed the gold coin across the counter toward her. Then he looked at Croft. "I'll also take 2 bottles of your finest quinine tonic," he said, his voice crisp. He placed another $4 on the counter. "And please wrap the Alya carefully. I would hate for it to be damaged." That was a close call. Before we see how our hero navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. With the transaction complete, Arthur picked up the carefully wrapped parcel and the small bag containing the medicine. He tipped his hat to Nita. "Mom." As he turned to leave, Nita found her voice. "Wait." He paused at the door, looking back. "I have others," she said softly, "at my home, if you wish to see them." A small, genuine smile touched Arthur Pembroke's lips for the first time. It transformed his weary face. "I would like that very much," he said. And with those words, the kiln of Nita's life, which had been smoldering with the last embers of hope, felt the first rush of a new, unexpected fuel. The path to Nita's home was not a path at all, but a memory worn into the earth, leading away from the grudging grid of Redemption Gulch and toward the open arms of the chaparral. She led, and Arthur Pembroke followed, the wrapped Alya held carefully in his arms. The silence between them was vast, filled only with the crunch of their footsteps on the dry soil and the whisper of the wind through sagebrush. Nita's camp was nestled in a shallow cove carved from a low mesa, sheltered from the worst of the winds. It was a simple place, a sturdy wickiup of willow branches and hides, a stone-lined fire pit, and off to one side, the source of her livelihood and her art. Her kiln was little more than a depression in the earth, lined with rocks and covered by a mound of broken pottery shards. Beside it, on a rough plank, sat a half-dozen finished pieces. They were beautiful. Each one was unique in its shape and design. A seed jar with a narrow opening, a bowl as delicate as a desert flower, another Alya painted with the sacred form of a water bird. They glowed in the late afternoon sun, a small army of silent, graceful sentinels. Arthur stopped, his breath catching. He had seen collections in Boston museums, artifacts displayed behind glass, but this was different. This was life. He saw the thumbprints of the maker, the faint smoky smudges from the firing. He saw Nita's resilience and her heritage made manifest in clay. He carefully set down the wrapped pot he carried and walked slowly toward the display. He didn't touch them, maintaining a respectful distance. "These are magnificent," he said, his voice quiet with awe. Nita watched him, her arms crossed over her chest. She had lived a life of observation, and she observed him now. He was not like the other white men she knew. They looked at her land with eyes that calculated acreage and mineral rights. They looked at her people and saw either a threat or a nuisance. This man, he looked at her pots and saw the story inside them. Still, she remained guarded. Trust was a currency far dearer than gold, and she had little of it to spend. Arthur Pembroke was a man adrift. He had come west not for adventure or fortune, but for an ending. The bank he worked for in Boston had been swindled by a series of fraudulent reports about a silver mine in the hills near Redemption Gulch. It was his job to come here, assess the worthless hole in the ground, and liquidate whatever meager assets remained. It was a task he performed with the detached efficiency that had made him a successful banker, but it was a hollow success. A year ago, he had buried his wife, Eleanor, and their stillborn son. The world of ledgers and contracts that had once felt so solid and important now seemed like a fragile cage. Boston was a city of ghosts for him. The West, he had hoped, would be a place of quiet forgetting. Instead, he'd found only a different kind of emptiness in the dusty, grasping town of Redemption Gulch. Until this afternoon, until he saw a woman of quiet, fierce dignity being cheated, and in her hands, a piece of art so pure and honest it felt like a rebuke to his entire world. In that moment, something in him had shifted. An old, dormant instinct, not for profit, but for justice, had awoken. He turned from the pots to face her. He saw her camp, saw the scarcity of it. He saw the patch-worn blanket on her sleeping roll, the single cooking pot by the fire. He saw her pride and her poverty existing side by side. "You live here alone?" he asked gently. "My husband, Cale, joined the spirits in the last cold season," she said, her voice flat, offering no room for pity. "I'm sorry for your loss," Arthur said, and the words were not a platitude. He meant them. He knew the shape of that particular void. He cleared his throat, shifting into a more familiar, professional tone, though it felt inadequate here. "Mrs. Anita, what I am about to propose is a business arrangement. Nothing more." She raised a single, questioning eyebrow. "The pot I bought from you today," he began, "I will send it to a colleague in Boston who deals in antiquities and fine crafts. I'm certain he will value it as I do. I believe there is a market for this. A significant market." He gestured to the other pots. "I would like to buy all of these. At the same price. $10 each." Nita's eyes widened slightly. That was $60. A fortune. "Furthermore," he continued, gaining momentum, "I would like to commission you to make more. I will provide you with a stipend for your materials, your food, your medicine, for whatever you need to work without worry. I will fund your kiln. In exchange, I will have the exclusive right to purchase and sell your work. We will agree on a fair price for every piece, a price that honors your skill. I'm a banker, Nita. I know a good investment when I see one. And this," he said, his gaze sweeping over the pottery, "is a magnificent investment." She stared at him for a long time, her dark eyes searching his face. A business arrangement. He had used those words deliberately, to give her a framework she could accept without sacrificing her pride. He was not offering charity. He was offering a partnership. It was a clever proposal, and a generous one. Too generous. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharp as an obsidian arrowhead. Why would a Boston banker do this for an Apache woman? Arthur's professional mask faltered. He looked away for a moment, toward the distant mountains turning purple in the twilight. "Because my world is full of men like Silas Croft," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its banker's polish. "Men who believe that value is only what they can steal from someone else. I have grown weary of that world." He met her gaze again, and she saw the profound sadness he carried. "And because I recognize a master of her craft when I see one, it is an honor to be able to support it." His honesty was a disarming thing. It bypassed her defenses. She thought of the child growing within her, of the cold nights to come. She thought of the quinine tonic in a bag he had carried for her. This man's help could mean the difference between life and death. Slowly, she gave a nod. "I will need better clay," she said, her voice practical, testing him. "The good deposits are further up the river. It is a 2-day journey. Then I will hire a wagon and a driver to take you there and bring back as much as you need," he responded without hesitation. "The black pigment I use is from iron-rich stones that must be ground for many hours. Then I will pay for your time as well as the product." It was real. This was happening. A fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl within her. She took a deep breath, the cool, evening air balm. "I accept your arrangement, Arthur Pembroke." He smiled again, that same small, weary smile. "Excellent. We shall begin tomorrow." News of the arrangement spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. Arthur Pembroke, the fancy Eastern banker, had lost his mind. He'd set up the Apache widow in business, paying her absurd prices for mud pots. Silas Croft, smarting from his public humiliation, fueled the rumors with vitriol. "He's a fool," Croft declared to anyone who would listen in his store. "She's got him wrapped around her little finger with some savage witchcraft. He'll be penniless in a month, and she'll run back to her people, laughing at the stupid white man." The town, for the most part, agreed. When Arthur walked down the street, he was met with scornful looks and muttered comments. He was an outsider meddling in things he didn't understand. He was upsetting the town's unspoken, ugly hierarchy. Arthur ignored them. He had dealt with sharks in boardrooms in Boston. The minnows of Redemption Gulch were of no concern to him. His focus was entirely on his new venture. He hired a buckboard and a taciturn old prospector to take Nita upriver. They returned 3 days later with several heavy sacks of rich, gray clay. He gave her a standing credit at the mercantile, much to Croft's fury, for flour, beans, bacon, and a bolt of warm flannel. Nita's camp was transformed. With proper nourishment and the medicine, the fever receded. Her strength returned. The constant, gnawing anxiety for her child's future began to ease. She worked with a focus and energy she hadn't felt since before Cale's death. The fear was still there, a shadow at the edge of her thoughts, but it no longer consumed her. Arthur became a regular presence at her camp. He would ride out late in the afternoon, after concluding his dreary business in town, and simply sit on a stool he'd brought for himself, watching her work. He rarely spoke, content to observe the quiet magic of her process. He watched as she kneaded the clay, her hands strong and sure. He watched her coil the ropes of clay one on top of the other, her fingers smoothing the seams until they vanished. He learned the rhythm of her work, the patient shaping, the slow drying in the shade, the careful painting of designs with a yucca fiber brush. She told him the stories of the patterns she painted. The whirlwind, which represented the creative spirit. The dragonfly, a messenger who carried prayers. The terraced steps of the kiva, symbolizing the journey from one world to the next. He listened, absorbing it all. He was a man of numbers and contracts, of a world that quantified everything. Her world was one of symbols and stories, of a value that could not be entered into a ledger. In turn, she learned about him through his silences. She saw the way his shoulders were perpetually tensed, as if bracing for a blow. She saw the profound loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he pulled a small, silver-framed photograph from his coat pocket. He stared at it for a long time before polishing the glass with his thumb. Nita didn't ask. She simply continued to smooth the rim of a bowl, giving him the privacy of her quiet company. She knew what it was to look at an empty space where a person used to be. The first shipment of pottery was ready a month later. Arthur had built sturdy wooden crates, packing each piece himself in straw with an almost paternal care. He sent them by stagecoach, along with a detailed letter to his colleague in Boston. Then they waited. During that time, their routine settled into a comfortable companionship. He would bring her news from the town or a newspaper from the East. She would share her simple meal of beans and tortillas with him by the fire. The space between them, once filled with the awkwardness of two different worlds colliding, was now filled with a quiet, mutual respect. He never crossed the line of their business arrangement, and she never offered more than she was willing to give. It was a fragile peace, a small island of civility in a hostile world. The hostility, however, was not content to remain at a distance. One afternoon, Silas Croft, accompanied by the town's corpulent doctor and the feckless sheriff, rode out to Nita's camp. Arthur was there, reviewing a tally of the new pieces she had completed. "Pembroke," Croft said, dismounting without being invited. His eyes swept the camp, lingering on the new sacks of flour and the warm blanket on Nita's wickiup. "We need to have a word." Arthur rose slowly from his stool. "I'm quite busy, Mr. Croft." "This is town business," the doctor interjected, puffing out his chest. "There are concerns. You're upsetting things." "Am I?" Arthur asked, his voice dangerously soft. "By engaging in a legal and profitable business transaction? Or is it that you're upset because you can no longer acquire masterpieces of native art in exchange for sugar water?" The doctor's face went florid. "That's not. It's about the principle of the thing. You're encouraging fraternization. It's not proper." Nita, who had been sitting by her kiln, stood up. She did not look at the man. She looked at Arthur. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were like dark fire. She was ready for this fight. She had been fighting it her whole life. "Gentlemen," Arthur said, his tone turning to ice, "my business dealings are my own. Nita is my business partner. Any insult to her is an insult to me. And I assure you, you do not want to insult my bank's legal counsel. Now, unless you have a warrant, I suggest you leave my partner's property." The sheriff shuffled his feet. "Now, see here, Pembroke. Croft is a respected member of this community." "Is he?" Arthur cut in. "A man who attempts to cheat a pregnant widow out of medicine? That's not what we call respected in Boston. That's what we call a predator." Croft's hand twitched toward the pistol at his belt, but he stopped. There was something in Arthur's stance, a steely resolve he hadn't anticipated. These men were accustomed to bullying those they perceived as weak. They didn't know how to handle a man who wasn't impressed by their bluster and who held all the financial cards. Defeated for the moment, they mounted their horses. "This ain't over," Pembroke, Croft snarled. "You're a guest in this town. Don't forget it." They rode off in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. Silence descended on the camp. Nita looked at Arthur, at the way he stood, a bastion of calm defiance between her and the ugliness of the town. He had called her his partner. He had defended her, not as a helpless woman, but as an equal. That evening, the first pains began. They were low and dull at first, a tightening in her back that she tried to ignore. She had weeks yet before her time, but as dusk settled, the pains sharpened, radiating around her belly in fierce, insistent waves. A cold fear seized her. It was too soon. She stumbled out of her wickiup, gasping, and saw the flicker of a lantern. Arthur was still there. He had been preparing to leave, but had lingered, perhaps sensing her distress. He saw her face in the lantern light, and he was at her side in an instant. "Nita? What is it?" "The baby," she gritted out, another wave of pain making her double over. "It is too early." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Arthur. He was a man of logic and order. This was chaos. This was life and death, raw and terrifying. He thought of Eleanor, of the sterile Boston hospital room, of the doctors with their grim faces. He would not let that happen again. "The doctor in town is a fool," he said, his mind racing. "There's another one in Silver Creek. A better man. It's 20 miles. There is no time." Nita gasped, clutching his arm. "I'll make time," he said, his voice a bedrock of certainty he did not feel. "I will ride. You stay here. Keep the fire high." He helped her back inside the wickiup, settling her onto her blankets. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "I will be back before sunrise. I promise you." He ran from her camp, untied his horse with frantic haste, and spurred it into a gallop toward the dark outline of the road. He rode like a man pursued by demons, the promise he'd made to a dying wife echoing in his ears. This time he would not fail. The ride to Silver Creek was a blur of pounding hooves, whipping wind, and desperate prayer. He pushed his horse, a fine but city-bred animal, to its absolute limit. He found the doctor, a grizzled, no-nonsense man named Harris, and pounded on his door until a light appeared. He didn't bargain or explain. He pulled a fistful of money from his pocket and threw it on the man's table. A woman is in premature labor. An Apache woman. Outside Redemption Gulch. Come now. Dr. Harris looked at the money, then at the wild-eyed, dust-covered banker. He saw the desperation and recognized it as genuine. Without a word, he grabbed his bag and followed. They rode back through the fading night, the doctor's sturdy Mustang easily keeping pace. As they neared Redemption Gulch, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. When they arrived at Nita's camp, the fire was burning high, just as he had asked. Arthur's heart was in his throat as he dismounted and ran to the wickiup, the doctor close behind. He found her pale and exhausted, but holding on. The pains were coming faster now, harder. Dr. Harris took one look at her and went to work, his movements efficient and calm. He sent Arthur for boiled water and clean cloths. For the next few hours, Arthur was no longer a banker. He was a nurse, an assistant, a terrified spectator at the most elemental of dramas. He held Nita's hand when the pain crested, wiping the sweat from her brow. In those moments, the last vestiges of their business arrangement burned away in the crucible of her ordeal. He was not her financier. He was Arthur, and she was Nita. He was fighting for her, for them. Just as the sun's first rays touched the top of the mesa, a new sound filled the wickiup, the thin, furious wail of a newborn child. Dr. Harris cleaned the baby, a tiny boy, small but healthy, and wrapped him in a piece of the flannel Arthur had bought. He placed the infant in Nita's arms. Nita looked down at her son, her face a mask of exhausted, luminous love. She touched his tiny cheek with her finger. Then her eyes, heavy-lidded, lifted to meet Arthur's. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. There were no words. There was no need for them. In the shared fight for this new life, a bond had been forged that was stronger than any contract, more valuable than any gold. Dr. Harris stayed for another hour, ensuring both mother and child were stable. "She's a strong woman," he said to Arthur as he packed his bag. "The boy is small, but he's a fighter. They'll both be fine, long as she gets a rest." He looked at Arthur shrewdly. "You did good, Pembroke." Most men would have let her be. After the doctor left, a profound quiet settled over the camp. Arthur sat by the fire, listening to the soft sounds from the wickiup. He felt hollowed out, yet fuller than he had in years. The ghost of his own loss was still there, but it was no longer a tormentor. It was a quiet companion, a scar that reminded him of the precious, fragile nature of life. Later that day, Nita called to him. He entered the wickiup to find her propped up, the baby sleeping soundly in the crook of her arm. "He needs a name," she said, her voice soft. Arthur nodded. "It is your right to name him." "Among my people," she explained, "a name is sometimes given to honor a great deed or a person of strength who has helped the family. A person who stands as a shield." She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. "I will call him Arthur." Arthur Pembroke felt the words like a physical touch. A name, his name, given not to his son, but to hers. It was a gift of such magnitude, such trust, that it humbled him to his very core. He couldn't speak. He could only nod, his throat thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It felt like coming home. The week that followed was an idyll of peace. A telegraph had arrived from Boston. Arthur's colleague was ecstatic. The Alya was a masterpiece. He had sold it to a wealthy collector for $150 and had standing orders for more, at even higher prices. The letter contained a bank draft for a staggering sum. Their venture was a success beyond their wildest dreams. But the money seemed secondary now. Arthur's days were spent caring for Nita and the baby. He cooked for her, fetched water, and kept the fire going, insisting she do nothing but rest and nurse her son. In the quiet evenings, they talked. She told him of her childhood, of Cale, of the joy and sorrow that had shaped her. He, in turn, finally spoke of Eleanor. He told Nita about her laughter, her love of books, the way she had arranged flowers in their Boston home. He spoke of the crushing, silent grief that had driven him west. In sharing their stories, they laid their ghosts to rest, not by forgetting them, but by giving them a place of honor in the presence of a new, living warmth. The pottery sat, unfired and untouched, but their lives were being reshaped on a different wheel. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a letter, delivered by the stage driver. It was not a friendly correspondence. It was a legal notice, pinned in Silas Croft's spidery hand on the letterhead of a shyster lawyer from a neighboring county. The notice was blunt. It claimed that the land on which Nita's camp was situated was part of the old, defunct Redemption mining claim, a claim which, upon the liquidation of the previous company's assets, had been purchased for a pittance by one Silas Croft. It declared Nita a squatter and gave her 7 days to vacate the premises. If she failed to comply, the sheriff would be authorized to remove her by force. Arthur read the letter twice, his blood turning to ice. Croft had been beaten in the court of public opinion and in the world of commerce. So now he was resorting to the law, twisting it into a weapon. The man wasn't just a predator. He was a viper. Nita watched his face as he read. "What is it?" He explained it to her, his voice grim. Her face, which had been filled with such softness and new motherhood, became a mask of stone. "This is my home," she said, her voice a low whisper of fury. "My mother was born on this land. My husband's bones are buried on that hill. To be driven from it now, with a newborn child, was not just an eviction. It was a desecration. It was a death sentence." Arthur put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You will not win, Nita. This is not about land. This is about spite." He looked from the legal notice to the distant, uncaring facade of Redemption Gulch. The banker in him, the cold, calculating strategist he had been in Boston, began to awaken, but this time it was fueled by a fire of righteous anger. "Croft has made a grave error," Arthur said, his voice quiet and deadly serious. "He thinks he is playing a game of dusty Western land claims. He's forgotten that I play in a much bigger arena. He wants to use the law." Fine, a cold smile touched Arthur's lips. "Let's show him how the game is truly played." He spent the next 2 days in a flurry of activity. He sent a series of lengthy, coded telegrams to his bank in Boston, to legal contacts, and to the Territorial Land Office in the capital. He paid the telegraph operator a handsome sum for his speed and discretion. He spent hours poring over the copies of the mining company's liquidation documents that he still had in his possession. He was no longer a grieving man seeking solace. He was a shark that had scented blood in the water. Nita watched him, a silent partner in this new battle. She saw the transformation, the way his thoughtful demeanor was sharpened to a razor's edge. She felt no fear. She trusted him completely. She went back to her clay. While he fought with paper and wires, she would fight with her art. She began to shape a large bowl, her hands moving with fierce, determined grace. On its surface, she began to paint the story of the Uctina, the horned serpent of her people's legends, a creature of immense power that could be defeated only by a warrior pure of heart. The 7th day arrived, gray and overcast, the sky threatening a storm that matched the mood on the ground. As promised, Sheriff Miller, his face slick with sweat, rode out to the camp. Behind him, on a fine black mare, was Silas Croft, his face alight with smug triumph. A small crowd of townsfolk, eager for a spectacle, trailed behind them at a distance. Nita stood outside her wickiup, the baby strapped to her in a cradleboard. She looked small and terribly vulnerable against the vast landscape, but her back was straight, her chin high. Arthur stood beside her. He was not dressed in his usual Boston suit. He wore sturdy trousers and a plain shirt, the attire of a man who was here to stay. He looked calm, almost serene. "Time's up, Pembroke," Croft called out, his voice dripping with malice. "I'm taking possession of my property." "Sheriff, do your duty." Sheriff Miller dismounted, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the law is the law. You'll have to gather your things and—" "The law, Sheriff?" Arthur's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. Whose law are you enforcing today? Mr. Croft's personal version of it. I have a legal deed. Croft sputtered, holding up the paper. You have a piece of paper, Silas. Arthur countered, taking a step forward. He held a sheaf of papers of his own. I, however, have the truth. He held up the first document, a large, official-looking map with a wax seal. This is a certified survey map from the Territorial Land Grant Office, which arrived by special courier this morning. It confirms that, as per the treaty signed with the Apache Nation in 1868, this parcel of land, from the river to the western face of this mesa, is sovereign tribal land, held in trust. It was never available for private claims. Your mining deed was fraudulent from the moment it was filed. A murmur went through the crowd. The sheriff stopped dead in his tracks. Croft's face went pale. That's a lie. A forgery. Is it? Arthur asked smoothly. Feel free to challenge the United States government in court. I'm sure they'll be interested in your methods. He raised a second document, a telegram. But your land problems, Silas, are the least of your worries. His voice dropped, becoming colder, more precise. This is a wire from the First National Bank of Boston. It concerns the series of loans you took out over the past 5 years. Loans you secured using the deed to your store and its inventory as collateral. Loans which, I discovered, you were significantly delinquent on. Croft looked as if he'd been struck. That's private business. It became my business when you threatened my partner, Arthur retorted. On my professional recommendation, the bank has decided you are a poor risk. They have called your loans. You have until noon tomorrow to repay the full amount, with interest. All $8,600 of it. The amount hung in the air, stunning the crowd into silence. $8,600 was an impossible sum. And if you cannot, Arthur continued, pressing his advantage, the bank has authorized a third party to purchase your debt and seize your assets. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. That third party, Silas, is me. It was a masterstroke of financial annihilation. Arthur had not just disarmed Croft. He had destroyed him, using the man's own greed and debt as a weapon. Croft stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The smugness was gone, replaced by the sheer, naked terror of a man watching his entire world crumble to dust. Sheriff Miller, seeing the balance of power shift so completely and irrevocably, backed away. This is a civil matter, he stammered. Not for the sheriff's office. He practically ran back to his horse and fled. The crowd began to disperse, talking in hushed, awed tones. They were no longer looking at Nita as a spectacle, but at Croft, the town's fallen tyrant. Croft was left alone, his fraudulent deed fluttering from his limp hand. He looked at Arthur, his eyes filled with a new, pathetic kind of hatred. Then he looked at Nita, standing proud and untouched. He had tried to crush her, and in the end, he was the one who had been broken. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, a man already defeated, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own spite. Silence returned to the camp, deeper and more profound than before. The threatened storm seemed to have passed, and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the scene. Arthur walked back to Nita's side. The papers in his hand fluttered in the breeze. He looked down at them, the instruments of his victory, and then let them fall to the dust. They were no longer important. Nita looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming relief, of gratitude, of a love that had been forged in fire and defended by a quiet, brilliant courage. She reached out and took his hand, her small, clay-dusted fingers lacing through his. In front of her home, on her land, with their son sleeping peacefully on her back, their two worlds became one. He was no longer the Boston banker, and she was no longer the Apache widow. They were family. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that needed no words. He looked around the camp, at the wickiup, at the kiln, at the magnificent, unfinished bowl telling the story of the Uctina. The kiln, once a symbol of her desperate bid for survival, was now the hearth of their shared life. He knew then that he would not be returning to Boston. His life, his future, was here, in the dust and the beauty of this harsh, magnificent land. He had come west to close a ledger on a failed mine, but had instead made the single greatest investment of his life. He had fueled a kiln not with cash, but with compassion, and from its flames had emerged a love more precious than any gold, and a future as bright and resilient as the polished surface of Nita's art. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.